Pankaj abandoned the quintessential high case joke, so I'll abandon the quintessential post lunch joke. Right? Because he also told me twice in the short span of 30 minutes that lunch after lecture is bliss, lecture after lunch is punishment. So I'm going to invite all of you to share my misery. Right? I don't think we've designed it this way, but I think one of the beautiful things when things emerge cohesively is this. If you look at the lectures in the morning, we spoke about the core essence of identity and culture, and then we looked at systems and mechanisms, and of course, because we have the burden of proving that we looked at it through the prism of Dharampalji's works, but it doesn't need any other research work to tell us what we experience every day. We already live it. But the institution that guides both culture and education in modern world today is state. So we didn't plan it exactly this way, but it is a nice tripod to hold all the ideas together. Who we are, how did we transmit that, and what is the institution today that we need to build, enhance and stabilize to make sure that these things remain the way they are. Our education system is what it should be, and our culture is what it has always been. So this session is going to be on state and how to think about state. And I'll use sometimes to understand what is truly valuable about ourselves, we also need to examine what the world has. So in my lecture, because we began with who we are and we looked at our inside out approach to our ideas, I will take a detour from what the world is, particularly in the ideas of state and politics and purpose. What is the movement that we are in today? What are the ideas of state? Where do those ideas come from? What does it mean for policy making? What are the questions in policy making? Once we understand that, then there is a rich complex synthesis possible in our minds as to how the world is presenting a certain facet and how do we look at it from our side. So this compounded learning is what we aim to do. Every time we talk about these sessions, the whole workshop is designed to make sure that these concepts are jostling for space in our mind. And they are, there's a rich combustion and there's a rich internal debate and a rich habit of mind that is developed through this. So it is with that purpose that I want to start. I want to do it in three interrelated elements. I want to begin with the idea of knowledge and knowledge production itself. Because every time we talk about state, it's almost like a very concrete institution, right? State immediately, the word state itself conjures the images of, in modern times for us, I come from Hyderabad. It's a very, very stark realization of how much the state has alienated the individual. If you look at the buildings that the chief ministers have, and I'm sure this is the case in every city, but in Hyderabad particularly, after Telangana government came in, which came in on the back of a people's movement for a new state, where the whole idea was that there was a cultural imposition, therefore you need a new state, we are actually recognizing our identity. The entire area of what is called Begumpet was cordoned off to build one of the biggest palatial bungalows, which has the highest security perhaps in India for any CM. It's almost like that entire road, which is a main street for Hyderabad to commute from Hyderabad and Secunderabad, that entire thing got cordoned off. So the minute we talk about state, we get this idea of ambassador cars, we get the ideas of lal battis, we get the idea of big buildings. It's very, very concrete. State is not a supple idea in our mind yet. And therefore, we have actually equated state with power. Of course, it is a dynamic of power, but the way we looked at state is quite different. And state today is just an imagination of what brute power looks like, right? And when we look at state, we have actually forgotten the link to knowledge. Because the power has primacy, we forgot that there is a certain idea of how governance should be, which actually leads to the institutions that you set up. So the link that I want to establish is with actually what has happened in the West, how did they come about to create these structures that we are mimicking now, and what does it mean to reclaim through a knowledge system? Because the link here is how do you reimagine these things from an Indian knowledge system perspective. Yeah, so some ideas that I'd like you to keep in mind as you think about this. Whenever we talk about public policy, it operates at the intersection of these things. It operates at the intersection of what we call nations and governments, society, economy, and the individual. Particularly because Pankaj spoke about the Runa and the idea of dharma as the ability to repay the Runa. But we conceptualize state and progress today in the name of three things: democracy, human rights, and free markets. Ultimately, the role of state today is imagined only in the context of how it promotes democracy, equality, access, inclusivity, how it enables markets. The role of state itself is defined as enabling markets, and how it protects human rights. So whenever we talk about state and when we are interacting and interfacing with public policy as a discipline or scholars from other discipline, and when we position it from IKS, we have to be very cognizant that what we mean by state, what we are talking about Rana, what we are talking about Dharma is actually not only antagonistic but also unfamiliar with the way it is positioned right now. The challenge is not so much that they are antithetical to us, the challenge is just sometimes the lack of familiarity itself. You are speaking in two different registers. And this is also the challenge which Arnold King talks about in politics of, he talks about the three politics of language, and he says we are talking past each other, and this is happening between IKS and other disciplines as well, because we haven't established a common bridge on what our vocabulary means and how does this vocabulary synthesize with the rest of the disciplines. So when we talk about state and public policy, we will have to definitely take care of the individual as well. Now this is not new to us. Mahabharata, the greatest text on governance, like it is said about Mahabharata, whatever is in Mahabharata is to be found everywhere else, and whatever is not there is not to be found anywhere else. It just means that Mahabharata is the meta pedagogy, like how Shastras are, like how all the things that we spoke about in the morning, the ideas of karma, punarjanma. This is the meta pedagogy for how do we govern everything from the individual to larger and larger set of collectives, Eka, Kula, Grama, Nagara, Prithvi, and then the entire cosmos itself, bound together in the principle of Atma, which is of course the difference that we have. But Mahabharata gives us the best principle of governance. It says that the sum total of all knowledge, everything that we do in IITs, everything that we do outside, everywhere where there is a pursuit of knowledge, the outcome of that knowledge should be a better way of governing ourselves in various fractals, right? It can be at your Kutumba level, it can be at a Samaj, your residential welfare association, it can be your city, it can be your state. But ultimately the art of governance is the sum and substance of the fundamental outcome of knowledge. This is a civilizational take on this. But why do we have a reason to discuss this in the context of IKS? If the current system was already working, then it makes more sense to actually advance it. And if you are going to challenge, and if we say that we need Indian knowledge systems and there is a decolonization process underway, it means that we also have the responsibility of articulating what is currently wrong, not just emotionally, but also through an examination of the intellectual history. Now, in the intellectual history, I think we can begin our examination with what has happened in Europe about 400 years ago. And this is actually a schizophrenia at birth for modern Europe, because the greatest time period that they think about when science triumphed over religion and faith is also the birth of colonization. For them, this is a twin origin crisis which they always have to straddle, and therefore they have a twin journey. On one hand, the idea of scientific and the great material advances that scientific establishment has given, they continue, and there is a great feedback loop that tells them that they are accruing knowledge, power and progress through that. But there is also guilt and shame, the same instruments that they used to colonize, which are now being used to colonize them. Guilt and shame was also born at the same time as science did. Now, why did this happen? There are many levels of inquiry that is possible in this, but I like what his name is Gregory Enricus, and he has an examination of this. He is a psychologist, and therefore I find psychology as a good perch, because I look at psychology, and I'll talk a little bit about psychology in the context of IKS now. Psychology is a good bridge between the natural sciences and the social sciences, and he talks about two gaps that enlightenment has. He calls it the enlightenment gap. He says at first level, and we know this, we've spoken about this in different terms, there is a challenge of the fracture between the objective and subjective, and I'll expand on this a little bit more about what it means, where there was a separation between, Pankaj began his speech today talking about that fact that Indians or Indian mind or Indian culture and civilization does not reduce the total to its sum of its parts and then examine each part and try to rebuild. It does not happen because we grasp the whole. Ours is a sutra based culture. But in the Western scientific advancement, because of the nature of their method, it also meant that it created a culture of reductionism, and there was a accepted separation between the subject and the object, the material and the sacred. It pans out in different ways, just the way we spoke about unison between the loka and shastra, the desha and marga. For them, the separation, it's the other way. They separate the object and subject, they separate the matter and mind. Everything is looked at as a separation to be isolated and examined and decomposed to its fundamental parts and then hopefully rebuilt. Now there is challenge, there is tremendous progress possible with that, but there is also tremendous challenge. The way it manifests in knowledge production, this challenge of separation between mind, matter, sacred and material, is that you have a fundamental separation between your scientific knowledge systems and your social knowledge systems. And what we call the university structure today, how we've compartmentalized our departments, how we approach education, disciplines, centers, departments, all of that is a fundamental function of this separation that has happened in European academia around 16th century, because it happened in a certain historical context where the Enlightenment was a flourishing or a revolution of the human mind against imposed faith from above. Because Christianity and the experience with Christianity and religion was so visceral for them, they revolted, and when they revolted, they used science. So in about 16th, 17th century, they exchanged gods. They exchanged their religious gods with the new gods of freedom and reason. And that is why we have to be able to empathize with them. Whenever we talk about Indian knowledge systems, it is not just that they, it's the unfamiliarity, but also there is a cultural memory for them of a very visceral distrust of religion. And because we say Indian knowledge systems and we say temple, temple is automatically related to religion, and therefore they correlate it with the experience that they've had with religion. That is their challenge. Therefore there needs to be, what Pathuriji calls it really well, I like it, we need to have a hermeneutics of common sense across disciplines. How do you make a conversation possible? Because when I say temple, I have a whole cultural memory and context. But your cultural context, when I say temple in public policy today, is because why are we having to do this project? Why is Pankaj doing this research on what are the models of temple governance by the society? It should be very, very logical and legible to the Indian state. It is not legible today because you have imported the struggle that Europe had between religion and faith. And similarly, it's a struggle for them. When we talk about temple or when we talk about IKS, because the imagery that we have is so laden with religious metaphor, and for us there was never any difference between religion and dharma. For them religion and dharma, the concept of dharma itself was not there. For them the binary is religion and science. So what they call as scientific is actually a projection of their own bad experience with religion. And enlightenment is such an important construct or such an important cultural memory for them, because that is the time when they claimed back human agency. That is why human right is so powerful as a narrative. Because if you don't have human right, then you have God imposition, which they've really worked very hard to overthrow. Right? So these are two challenges that that enlightenment has given them, where they are not able to produce a full integral knowledge. What does it really mean? What do we mean if we decompose this? Now we need to understand the question of learning and knowledge production itself to understand what this gap is and how it plays out. There are three ways to produce knowledge or to know, to really know something. The first way to know is the truth that we experience within us. All of our greatest experiences in life, all of our greatest emotions, all of our most key moments, love, motherhood, fatherhood, anxiety, joy, envy, jealousy, all of these things are true because we know it. It is first person subjective. I don't need a proof or a validation from outside to know that I'm angry. It is not measurable on a scale that you would consider scientific. It is not replicable because your subjective experience is different from my subjective experience. It is not generalizable because you and I might not experience it and share it in the same words, but it is still true. So the first way of learning that all of us are aware of is the first person subjective experience of things. And this is what mind mediates. And if you go back and look at enlightenment gap from this perspective, the fundamental gap is a void of the theory of the mind itself, and therefore a theory of self. They constructed the political institutions, they constructed the idea of human rights, they constructed the idea of democracy and universalisms like that, without an ontology or without a fundamental truth about mind or self. And this is their struggle in knowledge production. Now the second way of knowing knowledge production is intersubjective. The first one is subjective, where I know my deepest emotion and I don't need a validation. The second way is intersubjective. Intersubjective is where we are having this experience today and you and I are sharing a moment of exchange. Now we build a story about this together. Oh, he said this, I understood this, no, but somebody else questioned this. There is a theory that is being constructed through this dialogue, and there is an experience that we are both sharing by this construction process. So, this is the intersubjective process. This is what Pankaj mentioned as the sacralization of land. How did the Hindu civilization build this, this grand unification across such time and space, across such diversity, is by building on the intersubjective experiences. And because it had a subjective lens first, which is where papa, punya, karma, punarjanma, you don't even need a shastra validation. You know yourself that this is actually a moment of question that has come to me in my own mind, and then it might be validated later. What they did, the genius of the Hindu civilization, was in actually making sure that the Itihasa Purana corpus builds the intersubjective fidelity across this land and space and across millennia. So, these two ways of knowing, these two ways of producing knowledge and talking to each other and sharing experiences are unfortunately either diluted or are completely missing in the empirical objective way of knowing things, which is the great Western innovation. We will have to, because that is also married to technology and it is married to free inquiry and institutions that were created around that. They made extraordinary advancements in the third way of knowing, which is the objective way, which is why the method of actually decomposing things, examining them, trying to go down to their molecular level, the atomic level, and then build a theory, all of that, and we have to learn from that. We are behind on that. But today West recognizes that the challenges that they are having in culture, and what's happening in America right now is such a fantastic example of this void in knowledge, which then results in the three languages of politics and people talking past each other that Arnold King talks about, because it also means that because you don't have a way of sharing subjective experiences or recognizing subjective experience as valid, you have the conservative value system and the liberal value system, which are completely antagonistic. They are foundationally human, but liberals value three of, like Haidt talks, Jonathan Haidt talks about this. He says conservatives have a set of 6 values, which includes authority, loyalty and sanctity. In their context, it's coming from a Christian idea, but conservatives there accept authority, sacrality and loyalty as values for a civilization and a state to hold together. Whereas liberals actually do not recognize that. They only recognize freedom, reason and agency, right. So, this value system is not able to talk to each other because you don't have an underlying way of producing knowledge that is coherent. So, it's important that when we talk about state and when we talk about IKS, when we talk about education and learning, you see these things together. How we learn actually shapes what we believe in. What we believe in shapes the institutions that we give to ourselves, and the institutions that we create in turn once again propagate the values. And once you get into this loop, it's very difficult to get out of that. Now, therefore, and it's not a recognition from our side, this is a recognition that's coming to us from the West itself. They are themselves very, very acutely aware, and we should admire and respect them for that. They are very self-reflexive. The kind of parody that they can do on themselves, the kind of cinema that they can produce, the kind of art that comes out is extraordinarily self-reflexive, which is able to tell you that this is a fertile, self-assured civilization even today. They are able to look at themselves and mock themselves. Even in education, even in knowledge production, they are saying that we now need to have a multidisciplinary education, because the separation that has happened between science and social sciences and other forms of knowing meant that the university system was created with science as the apex, and rightfully so, because that the entire 200 period was the greatest flourishing of physics, of chemistry. The kind of innovations that we had and the challenges that Western civilization had, beginning with Newton to Einstein to Bohr to all of those extraordinary developments, actually convinced them very neurally, very feedback level, that we've actually arrived at knowing the full truth through science. And all the funding in the industry academia partnership was going to science, and therefore social studies, political studies, arts, humanities, because they've compartmentalized knowledge as that, had to compete with science for funding. And that is where the challenge and the race to become social science, to become political science, to actually conceptualize every frame or every pursuit of human knowledge as science in the objective frame. It might have a different, because you don't have the para there, right, you only have the temporal. So, that challenge meant that all of the departments started mimicking it. And when we became independent, somebody asked the question, why were we not able to throw it out of our education system? At a very structural level, we've mimicked, we've transposed the same structures of education that the West had. So, you also have departments, you also have separation, And therefore, it's a challenge today for you to imagine IKS in this structure. How do you fill an ocean in a bottle? IKS is consciousness. IKS is not department. IKS is not a vertical. IKS is a horizontal through which multiple verticals can come. But we are in a verticalized structure. Now, how do you fit a horizontal into a verticalized structure becomes a challenge that we are all articulating in different ways. For them, the articulation is as a multidisciplinary thinking. I know there are certain principles to that: unity of knowledge, first principles, decompartmentalized, abstraction, complexity. Great thinkers in modern times that we can learn from the West, who've all given us the same idea. It's just that they don't have the tradition, a living tradition, which can tell them this is how it actually is. Therefore, they have to abstract, they have to intuit, they have to debate. Wilson spoke about consilience, Herbert Simon spoke about epistemic modesty, Fuller, Buckminster, for those who follow systems thinking, Buckminster Fuller, fantastic, powerful thinker. Charlie Munger, the more illustrious partner is of course Warren Buffett, but the mind which made Buffett successful was Charlie Munger. And he has a very wonderful metaphor of a lattice work of mental models. He says that, develop this habit like a coat hanger. Take each discipline, take the coat of each discipline, hang it there, and over a period of time, let this lattice work of first principles from different disciplines play richly in your mind. And you start looking at phenomenon from different perspectives. If there is a phenomenon, how would history explain it? How would psychology explain it? How would sociology explain it? What is the explanation from evolutionary sciences? So he has given us that kind of perch. And then you have Peter Kaufman, who talks about worldly wisdom, which is the loca equivalent for them, and big ideas. Now, I mentioned psychology as the interesting bridge, which is where I think Indian knowledge systems also has a fantastic advantage, because we begin with the self and therefore a theory of mind and theory of self, and it is nobody has explored the human mind and human self as much as our civilization has. It is also a discipline that straddles it's somewhere in between. Where do you locate psychology in the disciplines, right? You have physical sciences, you have social sciences, humanities, which seem too abstract, too sort of non-objective, but you have in between this thing called psychology, which is a mind science, and mind is the mediator between these three things, right? How do you build that bridge? And IKS also, for those who are looking at careers in IKS, if there are young students, if there is one stream where we have the most compact and most comprehensive formulation, also courses and relevance for a future career, it is in psychology today, which will then of course be a meta discipline for others. But if you look at psychology and the Western experience with psychology, whether it is Freudian psychoanalysis or Jungian archetype or the Ken Wilber transpersonal humanistic psychology or Skinner's behaviorism, they've gone through a lot. What this tells you, like Pankaj said, is an oscillation. 1950s, if it was something else, 2014 it is something else. What it tells you is that there is no fundamental truth core which is able to explain all phenomena. So therefore, you are always, and there are two things here. It's a paradox, because without a fundamental anchor of truth, you've also innovated greatly on communication. Their genius is in the communication field, and their communication itself is a function of the World War II experience they had. It's a very interesting way to look at communication as a discipline and how it came about. There are two schools of communication that we get from the Western civilization. The first one that comes to us from the idea of communication as a manipulation by the speaker of the receiver. Because remember, again, it's a war psyche. Communication, innovation, everything happened in the idea of, okay, how do I send this message? How do I tweak you? This is why advertising, marketing, these things are so strong in US, because the entire discipline came from the political war kind of culture. But here, the purpose of communication itself, Pankaj spoke about para, pashyanti, vaikari, all of that is, the para, pashyanti, madhyama level is completely obliterated. What you have is vaikari and the purposing and weaponization of vaikari for manipulation. This is why, if you look at any of the movies, American movies and pop culture, you would see how well they are crafted. If you look at the rhetoric, anybody here has seen Wag the Dog? Wag the Dog is a fantastic movie that talks about spin doctors, right? The American spin doctors. The entire industry about lobbying, about spin. Now you have to understand that this has been culturalized. For them, this is a manner of communicating itself. So that's one. The second stream of communication that comes to us, which is closely linked to psychology, is from Europe, which is the semiotic school. If America was all about manipulation, the European experience, because of the Marxist influence, was to look at communication itself as a means of oppressed oppressor. Every communication analysis is based on this thing of who is oppressing whom, because power is the arbiter. This is a fundamentally different approach to how Bharatiya communication is, because we have Vaikari also as a flow from Para. It is diluted, but it is still sacred. And therefore, our philosophy of communication, when I am talking to you, when I am trying to explain something to you, my idea is neither manipulation, my idea is neither power projection. My idea in the Indian way, what we call the Hindu way, why Itihasa Purana, why Bhajan Kirtans, why all of this is the method of Sadharanikaran, is to become one with the listener. You and I become one to see the thing together. Now, when a fundamental aspect of civilization like communication is conceptualized either as manipulation or power, your state and all other institutions that you create on top of that are necessarily going to be constructs of that. Right? So, this is important, and again, why does this happen? This happens because in the absence of an ontology of self and mind, they have looked at using the power of technology and empirical sciences, they have tried to grasp at this thing called mind for a long time, and they have gone in different directions. It is only now, and it is super relevant to policy and politics, because for the first time now they are also talking about culture, evolutionary behavior together. When you mix culture, which is the way we do things, which is the which is what is sanctioned, what is celebrated, what is punished, what is not sanctioned, and you look at evolution, which is to also understand both the nature culture continuum, it is also gene and culture co-evolution, and then you look at behavior, which is the acharya, the actual behavioral way of enabling dharma, you see that they are also getting close to dharma. The reason IKS is relevant is not just because it is ours, not just because we are emotionally attached to it, it is because the central problems of organizing the individual in consonance with the collective, for which psychology and communication become a means, the knowledge of that is currently absent. There is a great clamor, there is a great quest, there is sincere quest. The best research on this is not happening in India, the best research on this is also happening in the West. But if we are able to convince ourselves, and if we are able to examine and have this dialogue, you would have a better way or a better dialogue. What is missing in all of this, even today in psychology, is the idea of sacred, that consciousness is first, psychology is emerging from that. That is a fundamental flipping of the entire Western episteme that has still not happened. Because for them, consciousness, even at this point, although there are different theories on this we are reading about, it is still an emergent thing. Consciousness is an outcome of interactions between materials, and therefore the research on mind still also is about neurochemistry, neurobiology, to put synapses or connectors to your brain and see how the waves and what gets triggered, right. So, the idea that there is a sacred core and you can evolve to that has still not taken root. This is what Enricus talks about as the unified theory of knowledge. They are in quest for that. Our position, and we have to make it responsibly but boldly, patiently but firmly, is that IKS is the unified theory of knowledge and the unified theory of praxis. It is not just knowledge. Pankaj has a wonderful saying, he says, knowledge is not asymptomatic, which means that Bharatiya ज्ञान अगर आप में है, आपका व्यवहार अलग नहीं हो सकता. Somebody who is studying the traditional system will not have any problem touching somebody's feet, because it is behavioral. It does not even matter whether the person, we don't deserve it, but because we come into portals like this, some student, but it is the samskar of that student, not your greatness. It is just the culture that is uplifting everyone, and it's a shared meaning. We all understand this. Now, you don't even need to know the greater truth, and this is where the idea of policy making in India also has to take a fundamental flip, and the idea of state itself also have to make a fundamental flip. For example, why culture is critical? How did we bind, एक सूत्र में कैसे बांध दिया, जैसा what he was alluding to. You had this universal ideas of rana, karma, punarjanma, which all of us, regardless of your language, regardless of your caste, regardless of your region, we are all able to identify with, because that is deeply personal. But the second condition for something to bind is not just it is personal, which means that I can experience it. It is also that when I speak about my experience, you also register it the same way, which means that these are universals. Which is why when I say namaste, this cultural symbol of namaste, you don't need to know the metaphysics behind it. You don't need to know that this is Purusha, this is Prakriti, this is coming together, whatever theory is there, I am sacred, you are sacred, you don't need to know. It's already been culturalized in a way to understand that this is sacred, this is respect, right? This is the power of culture. And policy that does not recognize this supple but very, very important realm of culture will always be from the top. It will never be from the people and from what binds people together organically. That is the challenge that we are trying to address. But to address that, you need to know why the separation in knowledge has happened, what is the challenge in the Western context for that today, and how do we do it. Like always, you don't need to look too further. If you just read Sri Ram Swarup ji, he's explained all of this in words that we cannot match. He says, if you regard man as a physical entity, our approach to education would be of one kind. If you regard, which is what enlightenment was for a long time, and I will talk about it in relation to public policy and paradigms in public policy shortly, but all of this is linked to how knowledge of the self itself is conceptualized. For about 200 years after science overthrew religion in Europe, the idea was still of material, right, utilitarian, very, very functional in its essence. And then if you have the idea of man as just a mental being, you will have another kind of approach to education. It is only when you think of man as a spiritual being who is having a human experience, only then and only then will you actually have a different conceptualization of education and by extension policy. So our challenge is to, like Sai Deepak ji has a very good statement in his first book, says how do you recognize the loss of something, the value of which you have not been told or you have not experienced. How do we have a twin challenge. If you at least know that it was valuable, then you would know you lost it, right. You don't know it is valuable and you also don't know you lost it. So our work is twofold, to show that it is of value and then to show the process of loss and then give you the confidence that you still have enough to rebuild. And this is the 3-step method that Sri Aurobindo also talks about. Everything that we have to do, it's already been said, there is nothing new that any of us can discover about IKS, to be honest. Sri Aurobindo puts it brilliantly, like always. He says there are 3 steps. The first is the recovery of the ancient spiritual wisdom in its full glory. He talks about new forms, but he doesn't abandon the ancient spiritual knowledge which is eternal. The flowering of that spiritual knowledge in all streams of learning, philosophy, arts, culture, education, all of that. And finally, the making of an institution in the political and the state sense in vision or in line with the vision of your spiritual wisdom, which he, by the way, says as the most toughest thing. He says the third is actually the most difficult. It's very interesting. He says recovering spiritual traditions is not as difficult. It's difficult, of course, but he doesn't say that is the most difficult. He doesn't even say using the spiritual wisdom to make sure your art, culture, education flourishes is also as difficult. But he says to flourish as a state and as a polity in light of the spiritual wisdom is the toughest. We have all 3 challenges, and all 3 challenges we have to do it simultaneously. And here, I'll put a plug because it also conceptualizes what we do at Brihat. We've been thinking about it for long in terms of what our work is, because we do content, there's a lot of content that we produce, there's a media organization, there is education and IKS that we do, we work with universities, we work with schools, we're doing some foundational research on what does an IKS school even mean, what are the different things, right from a board to pedagogy to daily rituals, what does it even mean. And we also work in some parts of the government on policy research. So it feels like there is a lot, even to us, it feels like that, but for us, the vision is very clear and integral because we are saying that the core is sacred. It is the sacred knowledge that this civilization holds, but it has to flow in 2 different vectors, but bidirectionally. One vector has to go from the sacred to the society and mediate between society and sacred, which is your sampradayas, your rituals, your gods, temples, all of these institutions. That work has to happen. And the other vector is the state. The sacred has to flow into the state. Pancharana has to become a government policy. It has to become a ritual in government. It has to become part of the state culture itself. So what we are trying to do is to be like a catalyst in these vectors. What needs to go from the sacred to the society? what needs to go from the sacred to the state, and what are those institutions. Here it happens through academia, through media, there it happens through policy and some other element. So you have to have, if you have to look at IKS as a system, and if you all have to combine and think of this future that we are talking about, then we need to see where we fit in. You have the sacred core, you have the society and the state, this is all integral, and this is mediated by different networks. Academia is one network, films is one network, media is another network, social, civil organizations are another network. All of these are nodes. Now what do we do? Where do we come in? How does IIT play a role in actually producing knowledge on these vectors? If we have to think of IKS as a strategy, we will have to start framing it this. Yeah, and so what I have said is also an exhortation of these two statements, which I think are critical for anybody who is looking at Niti. They do not come from Indian thinkers, but they represent an Indian idea, and we should respect that. The hallmark of a first-rate intelligence, and Scott Fitzgerald said this, is the ability to hold opposing ideas and remain functional. That I can hold two opposing ideas in my mind, but I know what is to be done today, tomorrow, day after, 160 days, 320 days. If we do not develop this meta skill, this meta temperament, we are not going to have an IKS. Because we have a really responsible job of looking at the world objectively, without shriveling and without being extraordinarily, unnecessarily proud of ourselves. In this path, especially for young students who are starting out, in this path there will be a lot of ideas which you will have to challenge and contend with. And therefore, the focus is on how do you develop the habits of mind to synthesize these things. And this is why Shastras are important. Shastras are not important just because they are ours. Shastras are important because Yoga Sutra gives you the best understanding of your mind, of your own self. Tarka Shastra gives you the best way to argue, to reason, to analyze. Natya Shastra gives you the best way to present, to make it aesthetic, to make it beautiful. For example, if you read Ashtadhyayi, it gives you linguistic intelligence to understand the link between language and ideas. Itihasa Purana gives you socio-cultural intelligence to know your place, your geography, your land, your people. When they talk about Vamsha, when they talk about genealogy, when you say I am from this place, then you know the entire historical migration right from why do they have a metaphor of Ram in their lineage. That is intelligence, that is socio-cultural intelligence. Education has to be something that gives all these 5 intelligences to children. It gives you the aesthetic intelligence to have a beautiful, blissful life. It gives you the psychological intelligence to know yourself and manage your own emotions, feelings, actions. It gives you cognitive intelligence because the world is going to present you with so many narratives, so many contesting options that you need to have a way to actually figure out what is of value. And you need to have linguistic intelligence and socio-cultural intelligence to be part of Indian society. Education's job is to produce people fit to be part of Indian society and to lead Indian society. And for that we need these learnings, right. And the second thing to know, particularly in the context of Niti, is that, and this is again because we are in a moment of political churn and everywhere you go, the debate is only on whether Modi is right or Modi is wrong. That's okay, you can have that opinion, but you need to know the terrain itself. You need to go beyond that, and that's where I like Harold Nicholson says, I learnt from this erratic but brilliant statesman, he's talking about somebody called Lloyd George, that apparent opportunism is not always irreconcilable with vision. Very important. Apparent opportunism is not always irreconcilable with vision, and volatility of method is not volatility of intention. I want us to, particularly in policy and political economy terrain, this is a super important thing to remember, right. Otherwise, IKS, if it does not equip you with complexity thinking, it is not doing its job. It has to give you the Chatushkoti logic. It is not just A or B, it can be neither A nor B, it can be both and B. This 4-dimensional logic that we have is not just in computers, it is actually in decision making in life. In any debate, because we all have animated debates, and where every single conversation that we have when we exchange is an increment of either trust or a decrement of trust. You are either increasing your trust in something or you are decreasing it, right, because we are all negotiating. It is through the Chatushkoti logic that you can stay firm. You can actually stay this one. You can actually say, I am comfortable with A and B together. I am comfortable with neither A or nor B at this point. It is actually very, very behavioral. It is not just computational. Okay, so specific to governance, what does good before we get into Indic ideas? And as I am saying this, please contrast it with the first session today where we were talking about culture, identity, institutions, Itihasa Purana. What is a good design for any institution? You have clear goals, right? And we'll have to examine then what are the goals of the state today and whether they are clear or not. You need good institutional design, which means that there has to be transparency, accountability. There have to be incentives to alter behavior, otherwise there is no change. There has to be a fusion between resources and accountability. If you fix accountability but don't give resources, you will have a lot of frustration. If you give resources but don't fix accountability, you will have waste, right. So, these are, I think I have shown this before, but for those who might not have seen it, complex change is a function of 5 things: vision, skills, incentives, resources and action plan. This is what any systems theory or students of systems you will be able to see, and particularly social systems, they are the most complex ones to change. If you do not have a vision, but you have the skills, incentives, resources and action plan, you have a lot of confusion. I dare say Congress today is this, although it is a political statement, they still have a lot of resources, right. They still have a lot of incentives, they have all the incentives to take back power. They have the resources, action plan also they have, they have Juach and Jitni Abadi Utni and all that. But what is their vision for nation? What is their vision for civilization? And therefore, it actually always has a tension between what is in national interest and what is in your party interest, which is also why if you want to analyze why Hindutva politics is strong today for those who are in political science, you have to see that it is working as a system where there is coherence between vision and resources and execution. It is because they held on to the vision that they are able to galvanize the electoral machinery. Apparent opportunism I have already mentioned, but the core vision of national interest is something that they have been able to demonstrate in a way that people believe. Whether we like them or not is different, but the fact is fact, it is there, right. Now, if you have vision, but you do not have skills, incentives, resources and action plan, you will have a lot of anxiety. In systems, you always need to look out for this. In IKS particularly, you need to see, and we need to empathize also with ourselves because we are doing this after 200 years. There is a lot of anxiety and it is okay to accept it. It is actually far more productive to say that, right. Now, if you have vision, skills, incentives, but you do not have the resources, there is a lot of frustration. This is all of us, that we are perpetually looking for the next month's payroll, at least if you are working outside of academia without any this one, that is the case. But if you have vision, skills, incentives and resources, but do not have an action plan of what is to be done, you will have a lot of false start. So, with that backdrop on knowledge and temperament and how to think about these things, I want us to venture into the question of state itself. I will pause here for a few minutes to see if there are questions or reflections that we should take at this time. But quickly summing up, education, knowledge production, civilizational history and personal temperament, they are all linked. That is the argument that I was making. So, let us move ahead on the idea of policy and whether policy is distinct. Now, what is, all of us understand policy, right? We have policy rules here, even this conference would have a policy of a certain starting time, you will have to sit, I will have to be here, we speak, we listen, all of that, right. When does a policy issue become a public policy issue? Anyone? IITs have some policies, right. Is it a public policy issue? I have some policy in my home in a certain way or in my residential welfare association. When does something become a public policy issue and is public policy distinct?
When we start affecting larger mass.
Okay, that's one. Fundamentally, when the prime mover is state, when the arbitration of this or the action on this is to be done by state, it becomes a public policy issue. Now, the question is, if it is all state, then what is the role of public in it, which is a critical question that we need to park and we need to revisit, because state is the prime mover, but it has to move for the public, right, and this is the conundrum that public has to. Now, why is this there? And if you were to examine the Western theories of state, and I'm deliberately going to the Western theories so that we can appreciate the Indian theory when we land on it, right. The nature of state itself is very artificial. For example, we can look at, we do not have time today, but maybe when we do the course we can go into the theories of state. I will just allude to those shortly. But state itself in the Western imagination, like we discussed in the morning session, because of the fundamental disjunct between man and nature. State is also seen as an artificial thing. You create something artificially to make sure that there is some order. Social contract hoga, jo bhi hoga, whatever theories that we have, we can discuss that. But it's an artificial thing. So it's an artificial thing, but it has extraordinary scope. When state moves, it's not a scalpel, it's a club. When they say COVID, you cannot say I will not do this policy at my home. So the extent of scope is the second thing that distinguishes scale. आप जो बोल रहे थे, that scale includes everyone. Diversity of factors, both through institutional evolution with, you have judiciary, you have bureaucracy, you have executive and legislature, but even otherwise, because particularly in India, because of the diversity of factors, public policy will always be distinct. Now to understand this, anybody here from management? But we can all relate to this example. Let's say we get to work for a private company. We graduate and we work in the industry, and our company gets a contract, let's say for a bridge or a mine, whatever in public, right? Now, if you are a project manager and if you have to work, who would be your stakeholders there? As a project manager working for a private organization, I would say my bosses, my customers, right? If I'm being traded, then my shareholders. So my world is only that. All I need to do is that there is a profit equation in building this bridge or extracting this mine in a way that actually satisfies my bosses, my employees and my shareholders if they are there, right? Now let's say you are a public leader. What is the difference between a project manager and a public leader? If you are a public leader, let's say there is a bridge here, but that bridge is actually going to come on a lake which affects the livelihood of a villager. Suddenly your scope, your stakeholder scope has increased so much more. It's a lot of challenge because a lot of people who are coming into industry do not understand the nature of the dynamic of public itself. What appears to you as madness is extraordinarily logical and almost vital for the politician. Just the way your stakeholder is important for you, his stakeholder is the constituency of that fisherman village or whatever that is there, right? So there is a natural tension in this. Diversity of factors means that there is also multiplicity of criteria. And that is why public policy has to be taught differently, because the operating logic of these realms, and I'm taking this from a book called The Cultural Contradictions of Capitalism by a person called Daniel Bell, and I feel it's very powerful framing. He says that in society we are operating in 4 different but autonomous realms. ऐसे 4 अलग-अलग realm में काम हो रहा है, बातचीत हो रहा है. Each of that has a different operating logic. वो अपने ही logic पे चल रहा है. What is the logic of politics? If you are a politician, not your normative imagination. If you are a politician, आपका logic क्या है? What should be your concern if you are a politician? You just have to come back to power. That's the only concern that you have. Rightfully so, because particularly in a multi-party complex society like Bharat, politics is the toughest job. It is the most extracting. I mean, yesterday we were there, right? First half of the event was all presentations, and then you have a leader walking in, and then you have 100 bodyguards, then you have the entire mahal changes. Now, if you have to tell that person that ANIA knowledge, for them that is the terrain that they are operating in, and we have to. It's not like Tejaswiji does not know this, but he is in that terrain. He has to operate in that terrain. He has to stand up for those photos of 100 people and do the BJYM youth leadership thing. He has to do that. So what appears as very dramatic and illogical to you is actually the life and blood for that person. But the challenge today is the role of state in a modern economy has been relegated or has been ordained as improving markets. This is a western transition that has happened. State का role जब classical enlightenment में था, it was around individual freedoms को protect करना. State का role यही था कि individual rights को protect करना. You build public infrastructure, there is capitalism, they will produce prosperity. For about 150 years in US and Western hemisphere largely, this worked brilliantly. But then they also figured out that capitalism, contrary to theory, actually increases inequality. So when the inequality increases, people will come back and start questioning leaders. So, they will have to start looking at distribution. But when you start distributing things produced by the market, your logic of populism is actually in tension with the logic of the market, which is efficiency, which is the debate. What is the role of state? Then we will get to what are the things that state can do, but it's conceptually it's very important to understand. State का पहले एक role था कि बस you protect the borders, you build highways, you manage storm water, you give us drainage facilities, you build some kind of technology, and the rest we will take care. This is the Western imagination. But as it happened, some people started extracting greater and greater value. Marx was right on that. Marx was absolutely right on that count. In his identification of problems with capitalism, he had a lot of sense. That's why it is of value. It's not, we cannot discard it. The solution is more dangerous than the problem identification. That's a different story. But the problem is true, right? So, the Western moved from liberal to neoliberal, where there is a bit of welfareism. Now, they don't know what is the role of state, because your entire culture is on the basis of human imagination, enterprise, risk taking. That is what Trump personifies, right? But Trump, look at the oddity today. It is the conservative businessman Trump who is actually deglobalizing, who is saying that, so Democrats are liberals, liberals are Democrats. That's the flux that the Western civilization is in. It is also at a deeper level, if you look at it, you look at the disjunct between nation state and ideology. Western civilization, particularly America, flourished because there was a nice compact between your worldview of liberalism, individual, this one, American dream, I will go to the moon, all of those stories that they tell themselves and exhort themselves into action, which was on human agency, with state as just protecting rights, and then the rest of it was to be markets and all of that. And it was all in the name of liberal this one. Now, if you look at what Trump has done in the Ukraine war, Trump has taken America out of the war, right? And he used a logic of my predecessor was wrong. He did not say the war is wrong or anything, war, because he might have another war where he might bomb somebody else. But he said, my predecessor is wrong in this, right? And he can blame Biden and all of that. But the decision was taken by a nation. It's not taken by Biden alone. So, this compact that the Western civilization had between ideology and nation state is also breaking. You are having to wage wars on ideology. Why is he doing that? He is saying that's liberals, that's commies, that's leftists. In attacking them, he is taking back a decision taken by his nation state, and he is saying America has nothing to do with it. I will make America great again. There is a very strong paradox in saying making America great again, while actually disengaging and absolving yourself from the decisions America has taken. That's okay, that's just political convenience, he'll do it. But where this disjunct will land, nobody knows right now. Actually, as of today when we are speaking, it's very difficult to say somebody is a Democrat or a Republican in America today. Because the classical, if you look at this election particularly, Trump has won on a democratic agenda. Middle class, wage, not having too many this one. All of these are traditionally the Democrat issues. He is not fighting on Christian supremacy or anything else. He is fought on exactly like Modi has won here today. He has combined welfare with public service delivery with national identity, with memory. All three of them should have actually been democratic issues, because liberalism and nationalism was not different for them in that sense. They were comfortable with that. But today there is a challenge. So, when you have this, the role of state itself is going to be questioned. Now, some questions for public policy enthusiasts and politics and Niti, you need to ask, whenever you are thinking about policy, you need to ask yourself some questions. Is public policy unique? Like I told you, it is unique because of nature of state. When does an issue become a public policy problem? Just because we are concerned about it, it does not become a state issue. There is any guess, how long does it take for an issue to become or to be noticed by a state in India? Any guesses?
20 years.
28 was the last survey. Close. Now, with the information architecture changing, it will change rapidly. When information architecture changes, state has to respond more urgently. And state is not actually designed to respond rapidly, because the way of state response is that there has to be a problem identification, there has to be a solution identification, and there has to be a political economy माहौल जिसको बोलते हैं कि ये टाइम पे ये बिल पुश हो सकता है, that also has to be there. Not only the problem and solution, but even the political window has to be open for something to happen. But with information architecture, you are having to, because it's coming on Twitter, it's coming on networks, there is an urgency every single day. And state all across the world, not just Indian state, all across the world, state is now struggling to deal with public expectation. This is going to be one of the defining challenges of the 21st century on how we can have an adaptive state. Can you have a responsive state? What we are having is a surveillance state, and that is the only way that state knows to function. When you push state into a corner demanding more and more, it will impose a rule. It will impose more and more kind of surveillance, because that's the nature of the Western state. That's what they've understood as power, right? So today you have two stories in the world. One story is that the American way, where the individual is supreme, or the other story of the world which is completely defiled all of America's expectations is the Chinese one, which is the surveillance state. So therefore, political and public policy analysis today has to answer these questions. How does media interface with policy making? Why are some policies grand and some policies incremental? Policy hota hai kaisa hai? Are all of them great announcements and great schemes? Sanjeev Sanyal ji has been talking about this. This is very, very critical. He is talking about process reform as policy making. Very, very small plumbing issues. What they have done is actually they have removed about 250 small clauses, not a big policy. None of us would have heard it. He has recently given a talk at IIT Mumbai. I would really encourage all of you to look at it. He has given 9 examples of extraordinary improvement in public service delivery, not through a new policy, but through a process reform. Simply taking away some plumbing malfunction that was there. So policy making today has to be also looked at as product development. अगर आपका website कुछ है, उसमें कुछ ये हो रहा तो you will tweak one fix that you apply. Like how in product development you have continuous builds, or you deploy always on deployment. State also has to move into an always on deployment. Now what does that mean? We don't know, because the machinery, like we've seen, every time state moves, it moves with so much of red lights and ambassadors and all of that. How does it get into plumbing? We don't know yet. There is an answer that Indian state also does not have. What about judicial policy making? It's another big issue. Just last 3 weeks we've been in this debate. Can judiciary make policies? Should it? What is the principle at play? Why should judiciary not make policies? They are not elected, because that will be the tyranny of the unelected. The principle in democracy is that good, bad, ugly, all of the decisions that happen by the state have to be traceable back to the public, and public will. And because bureaucracy and judiciary don't have an engagement with public, they cannot be engaged in policy making. But is that happening?
Also violates the central proposition of separation of powers, that an agency which is disbursing justice cannot keep.
That itself is because the sovereign is the individual. Absolutely, absolutely. The separation of powers comes from the principle that everything has to be traced back to the will of the person or the will of the public, and therefore separation of powers. You cannot accrue what is not yours.
But in principle, that has already been very clearly violated with judicial activism, which is selective.
That is the question. That is the question. Now, for those who are civilizational activists, we have a challenge. There are some issues where maybe the elected legislature will not move. How do you strategize then? We have a real conundrum. We recognize the risks of judicial policy making, but it is also true, and we should respect this, not just for civilizational concerns, even in real public service delivery concerns. It is true that when the state overran its writ, people got relief from the judiciary. That is also happened. Ecology mein hua hai, in different ways, in different, actually even very, very adversarial issues that have happened. As a principle, it is not right. As an exception, what Pankaj spoke about the context. What is the dharma? Dharma will always be subtle. This is the complex thinking that we need to develop. Again, I am trying to look at it the way it exists and introduce dharma or IKS into it. Now, we haven't designed this with an IKS perspective. Our perspective would not be separation of powers. Our perspective would be Samanya Dharma and Vishesha Dharma. Right? How do you design things with Samanya and Vishesha? Where do you privilege the universal? Where do you privilege the contextual? And to do that is what we get into the terrain of the real Niti Shastra of India. Why and how it is different. Now, if we say there is universal and contextual, and the entire civilization was built on it, and we are now making an argument that the state also has to be, molded in that way in Samanya and Vishesha, we should start using this whole worldview. Dushyant Sridharji in his book on Rama has a very beautiful short story which I think unpacks this complexity and introduces the third dimension to this. He asked this question, Sri Rama on the greatest day of his life perhaps, right, when he was about to be coronated as king, he is walking up and he is told that you have to go to the forest. Right? So, he obeys and he goes to the forest, and there is a whole dialogue bit with Bharata at that time he writes about, and he says why I am doing this. Bharata objects and he talks about why I am doing this. And Bharata says if you go, governance will suffer. How are you saying it is in the larger interest? He says the suffering of this is lesser than the suffering of a bad ideal. If the public tomorrow knows that a son has disobeyed at that time in the Yuga, disobeyed his father, that is a far greater danger. So, I am actually fulfilling a larger dharma. So, he is unpacking the problem solving that Pankaj spoke about in orders of dharma. But he says the same Sri Rama. So, in this you can say this is destiny. He has accepted his destiny and moved on. That is one lesson that you will get in popular contemporary terms if you do not have dharma. So, he asked the second question, when Sita Ma was abducted, he fought an intercontinental war to get her back. He moved all the way from where he was to Lanka to win her back. Did he accept destiny there? Does it mean it is free will? What was Sri Rama batting for? Was he batting for destiny? Was he batting for free will? Or was he just being inconsistent? Understanding, that is why Itihasa Puranas are so full of wisdom for us to understand this complex, weave making of sense that binds this one together. He says there is only one sutra that you need to understand. He is dharma himself. When it was his duty as a son and he saw the larger dharma was in accordance with that, he followed. When it was his duty as a husband, he did not accept destiny, he accepted free will. So, this binary between destiny, free will, for those who love being in these debates, is only in the binary when you do not have dharma. Dharma breaks all of these binaries. It breaks the free will versus destiny, it breaks the idea of whether normative or consequential, it breaks all of these debates. So, the third dimension that we need to understand is the consciousness of the actor. It is the consciousness of the actor, it is the dharma quotient in the actor which can mediate between the universal and the contextual. Just because Sri Rama has done something, I will use that example and do, no, you can't, because you do not have that, that is the ideal to mold your behavior against, but that cannot become an excuse for you to abdicate your responsibility. This also happens, our minds are extraordinarily powerful at fooling ourselves. The minute we read something, acha contextual hai, to maybe kuch contextual kar sakta hu. There is karma for that, right. So, this whole thing, if you have to understand what is the Indian way of policy making and niti, it is the principle that we get from Chanakya, and it is the only civilization, only knowledge system, only culture that directly links state to Indriya Jaya. This is the difference in policy making niti all over the world and Bharat. The separation of powers, the institutional design, all of the things that I spoke about are needed in the Western hemisphere because they do not invest in the consciousness of the individual through the paradigm of dharma, and therefore, they need to design extraordinary mechanisms to make sure that things do not devolve. The Indian way has been to invest in the potential of the human to become divine, so that whatever is available turns into Shubha. Whatever I do becomes Shubha. It is an extraordinarily opposite paradigm actually. We will have to synthesize creatively how it means today, but the Indian way has always been to link the state with the level and character and integrity of the leader. That is why Arthashastra is three things simultaneously. Arthashastra is economics because it has all the principles of economics. Arthashastra is statecraft because it has governance, statecraft, espionage, all of that. But Arthashastra fundamentally is a manual of leadership making for the civilization, because it talks about Indriya Jaya. And look at the equation that he talks about. He does not start with the state. He says, what is the ultimate goal? The ultimate goal is Sukha. Sukha, is at the top. Then he asks the question, what is the basis for Sukha? Right? Sukhasya moolam. And he says dharma. Okay, what is the basis for dharma? It is artha. Now you know, very quickly you start getting the mapping. What happens in human societies or human mind when you don't have enough material well-being? Jealousy, envy, theft. That is not the basis for dharma. Now it does not mean that you can accrue wealth any which way and call it artha as the basis of dharma. No. The basis for earning the wealth also has to be dharmic. But it is true that without the basis of artha, without material prosperity, you cannot have a dharmic society, because human tendency will go into devolution. Then he asks, what is the basis for artha? He says arthasya moolyam rajyam, which means in that context a country, a nation or a territoriality. Why? Human enterprise, economic activity, collaboration, creativity, all of that can only flourish when you have stability at your borders. Look at the clarity and look at the link. Sukha is the ultimate goal, dharma is the means, artha serves dharma and rajya serves artha, and lastly then it goes on, he doesn't stop there. He says, okay, what is the basis for rajya? And he says rajya's basis is indriya jaya. Look at the link between sukha, which is the collective sukha for all of us, dharma, which is the order that has to be done, prosperity, which is the base condition for all of us to experience that kind of well-being. For that you need a nation and a secure border, but for that you need leadership that has indriya jaya. This is a paradigm of policy making that is uniquely Indian, uniquely dharmic, which is not available anywhere. Which is why in this Ramarajya has a very organic connect. Because we know what we are getting there. We know that anything that happens in that ideal cannot be wrong. So this is and then he gives one more. What is the basis for Indriya Jaya? He says Indriya Jaya's basis is Vinaya. Humility. There are many ways. Sanskrit scholars can tell us exactly what he means in that context, because Vinaya also has many dimensions. And lastly he says, and this is the separation of powers in the Indian context, or the fusion, the harmonization, because the West will separate, we will fuse. He says the basis for Vinaya is Vruddhopaseva, service to the elders and the aged. Look at the cultural symbol in a policy making dimension. Why is he saying that? What is your neural feedback loop when you are in power? Every single minute, every single second when you are in power, your constant feedback is that everybody is afraid of you. Aap ja rahe ho to they will bend, they will open doors. We all know what authority looks like, what power looks like. So it is very natural, not just because you are a bad person, it is very natural that your feedback loop and the neural systems it generates itself becomes ahankara centric. And because you have power, it's very difficult. Why is this human folly so consistent across all time and space and across all cultures, that people who are power actually over exercise power and cause their own downfall? All of the history tells us that. Why does that happen? It happens because of a fundamental nature of things in Shadripu. Right? We get arrogant. Mada and Mada, so that is there. Right? So for the king, what is the anti-feedback loop? What is the feedback loop for Vinaya? To actually go and do seva to somebody who has been powerful, who would be your king, and to see the mortality of that. To see how frail, old, diseased you become. To remember, to get another feedback loop that you actually are not going to be permanently in this position. Right? This is the way Indian policy making was. It understood the nature of power very, very deeply, but it created the idea of dharma on top of that, which is why the movement that we had last year of Sengol in Parliament is an extraordinarily powerful civilizational movement. Now what is the ritual of Sengol? Sengol, anybody here from Tamil Nadu? What is the ritual of Sengol? The king, So the king is coronated, and before he ascends the throne, the Dharmaguru comes and taps on his head with that, and he says, who is powerful? If the king says, I, then he taps on his head, says Dharma. Second time he asks again, who is powerful? The king says, I. He taps with the Sengol and he says, Dharma is powerful. Third time once again, who is powerful? I. dharma is powerful, then you get to the throne. Now, the ceremonial nature of this is one thing, but the deep principle at a neural level is something else. The Indian philosophy of Niti, the Indian philosophy of public policy, we don't know, when we have to be sober about it, we have the principle, we don't have the manifestation today. What we know is that if you produce people of high consciousness, high integrity, your institutional integrity is an outcome of that. If you don't have that, you can create separation of powers, you can create legislations, you can create, but all of that would actually increase the transaction cost of trust. What the West has today is an unsustainable transaction cost on trust. And this is where the Indian method of problem solving, again, Mohan Raghavanji writes about this in his book, it's brilliant, and he spoke about this in our program Niti Vidhan also, says how does human decision making happen and how did the Indians do it? If you go to any big temple or if you go to any of the civilizational cultural institutions, you will see this. In the West, the transaction cost has to be, because it's human rights, my agency, I am investing in you individually on the ahankara side, not on the chitta, manas, buddhi side. I will have to convince you extraordinarily with intellect, with debate, with proof, with, in your case, you need to do double blind peer review to tell you something which is otherwise understandable in a common sense way. Maybe not abstract science, but at least most of the things can be understood. What we have done through these institutions, because we do not have a means of generating trust at scale, we have increased the transaction cost of trust by having to convince every single person. And every single person who is being told that he or she is special. So, I am investing in my ego and you have the burden of convincing me. It is a unsustainable equation. How did Bharat solve this? Bharat solved this through the collective arc of decision making. Now, if you have to understand this, would you give me your mobile phone if you don't know me? And I say, I'll just keep it for some time. There's a trust issue, right? There's the trust. But if we see an institution in temples where the phone has to be kept and hundreds of people are depositing there and go, you never met that person, but you do it. So, what Indian mind did as an analogy basically is that it created the meta structures which make collective trust possible, which is what all of these are. Now, we do not know what it means today. The creative work that is pending is to look at consciousness of the actor, collective trust as a means of generating larger social solidarity in institutions and designing policies around that. I am not saying that we have the final answer. What we have is the kernel, the eternal kernel that can regenerate. So, the Indian policy making is about investing in the Indriya Jaya of the, particularly of the leader. So, leadership in the Indian sense is not a right, it is not a luxury, it is a tremendous burden. If you read Arthashastra from this perspective, the king's life is so difficult. Every half an hour of the king is regimented. Every half an hour of the king is regimented. So, today, whether you like or not is a different story, and I am open to this one. But if you look at the lifestyle of Modi ji, why is that in public memory? They see that trait. Acha ye kal 18 घंटा अभी 20 घंटा इधर उतर गए. The trust is coming from a very deep civilizational idea.
Will go to
soldiers. That is actually a very classical Indian policy making style. That is the Arthashastra style. Right? Now, what is missing in IKS in a lot of ways is actually the attribution. Even the things that we know are good, we haven't attributed because we haven't had an umbrella term or a strategy. If we start accruing things, acha ye IKS hai, ye isliye, ye Arthashastra hai, then you will suddenly see IKS is not, there is so much of content even today, there is so much of praxis even today, right. So, this attribution is also critical. So, once again I will just sum it up. Policy making has to be looked at in relation to knowledge production. Knowledge production is a function of history and the institutions those history provides and the history that institutions create. When you have a non-integral knowledge production system which is then sent through academia, which is compartmentalized into departments, you will end up having a fundamental fracture between the material and the sacred, between the social and the scientific. These are the challenges that the Western civilization has had. And because we have imported those education structures and we have actually organized our education in the same way, we are continuing the same. It is not separate, state and education are not separate things to be pushed. State ko push kare to education bhi push hoga because it is all coming from the same learning paradigm that we have missed out. So, when we do this, then we can understand and ask the right questions, we can examine what is the theory of the state in the West We understand that public policy has a certain characteristic. We also understood the temperament that we need to cultivate, because we are challenging the status quo. We are also simultaneously discovering the value of what we have. This journey is a very rich intellectual journey, but it is a behavioral journey also, which means you need to be comfortable, sthir. Like in yoga, you need to be sthir. And once you do that, you see the difference in the institutional design of the West and the institutional design for Niti in Indian concept, which is fundamentally the consciousness of the actor, the dharma quotient, and reducing the transaction cost of trust in larger and larger collectives. This is our seed for policy making. I'll pause here. If there are any questions, we can take it. Thank you.